Hey, all, Brian here. So I'm going to read Chapter 7 of Warrior Priest of Dmon-li, Book 3 of the Morcyth Saga. Just so you know, if you haven't read this already, and you're thinking about reading the series, spoilers are ahead. This chapter there will be spoilers, and it's kind of a shorter one. So let's get started, shall we? Quick recap. Obviously, they escaped from the skull pyramid complex that they were in. Now they're just making their way through the swamps, head north, trying to get back to Cardri and their friends. Chapter 7. When James woke the next morning, the sun had already begun to lighten the day. Michael snored peacefully, and Jiron walked the perimeter of the camp out amongst the trees. He glanced at James as he sat up and came over. "Good morning," Jiron said. "Everything okay?" James asked. "Oh, yes," he assured him, "just walking around a bit. I hate sitting on one spot for very long. How's your leg?" James straightened it and said, "Better, but a bit tight. I think it may not hurt so much today." "Let's hope not," he said. Sitting down next to him, he asked, "How far do you think it is to Cardri?" Shrugging, James replied, "I couldn't even begin to guess. It took us over a week to make it to the mines, and that was on good roads with horses. Trudging through this," he continued as he gestured to the swamp, "who knows how long it will take us." "I would like to see Tursa again." "So would I," James agreed. "I'd really like to find some place just to rest and not have to worry about being eaten by some rhino lizard or have to sneak through an area filled with Empire's forces." From across the campsite, they heard Michael say, "Or cannibals." Sitting up, he glanced over at them. "I hate this swamp. Give me a good old city any day." "If we keep heading north, we'll eventually get out of here," James assured him. "I hope so," he said as he got up and joined them. Sitting down, he asked, "How much longer are we going to be here anyway?" "Like I was telling Jiron," James said, "I don't know. All I do know is that they don't last, is that swamps don't last forever." That's better. "That swamps don't last forever." "Then let's stop sitting here talking and get going," Michael said as he got to his feet. James reached over and grabbed his walking stick. Using it for support, he made it to his feet without nearly the amount of pain that maneuver had caused the day before. Holding the stick loosely, he waited for Jiron to get up and lead the way. "Are you feeling better?" Michael asked. Nodding, James said, "Much better, actually. Don't think I could run any distance, but the constant pain and throbbing seems to be easing up." "That's good," replied Michael. "I was worried about you." "I was worried about me, too," he replied with a slight smile. They traveled for several hours before they heard Michael's voice coming from where he lagged behind. "I'm hungry." Well, let's pause here for a moment. Now, okay. It's only been he injured himself, then they fought the headless torsos, and that all happened within a 24-hour time frame, and then they walked for a day, and now this is like the third day since he's been injured, and already he's feeling better. As reading this, I know originally I just wanted James to feel better, and I didn't want him to be hurt. Or maybe I didn't even think about it. But now, looking back, there's no way he'd be feeling better after 2 days after what he's gone through. So, my theory is the Star of Morcyth. I mean, if it has power over the undead, it may have power to rejuvenate and heal the one who carries it. So, I am thinking that the reason why he's feeling better, why his leg didn't get infected being in a swamp and battling undead who knows what, is because that amulet was protecting him. That's my theory anyway. Let's continue. "Michael, might be a good time to stop and eat," James said to Jiron, who was up a ways trying to find the way through. Jiron returned, saying, "I was hoping to find a clearing where we could build a fire," he explained. "We'll stop then, okay?" "Sure," James said, to Michael's dismay. "We can wait a lot longer." "We can?" Michael asked, just as his stomach let out a very noticeable growl. James and Jiron turned and stared at him, then broke out into laughter. "Well," he said, "I am starving. We haven't eaten all day." "Just a little while longer," Jiron said, "and then hopefully we'll run across a spot where we can build a fire without worrying about setting the whole area aflame." He glanced to James, and they both smiled, both grinned, remembering the last time they set the woods on fire. That was up near mountain mountainside when they were captured and they ramped the mountains. Michael glanced from one to the other, then asked, "What?" "Oh, nothing," James replied. Taking the lead again, Jiron once more made his way through the trees and undergrowth, searching for the way out. Using the waterway on his left for a guide, he was able to maintain a fairly consistent heading. Without it, they would have quickly been turned around and lost. After trudging through the swamp for a while longer, they came across another waterway moving parallel to the one they followed. One second, I got two in the wrong spot. Both flowed down from the north. As they continued traveling northward, the other waterway moved closer until they merged together. To their dismay, they found themselves on the inside of the fork. In order to continue, they would have to cross one of the waterways. The area on the inside of the junction of water was relatively flat and clear, so they decided to stop and have something to eat while they considered how to get across. James picked a handful of small rocks from off the ground and quietly went into the brush to hunt for lunch. Jiron and Michael built a fire. He returned several minutes later with 3 dead animals that Jiron took and prepared for the fire. Michael walked to the shoreline and gazed at the flowing water. "How are we supposed to cross this?" From where he sat by the fire, James hollered, "Swim! It's not that far." Turning back to him, Michael exclaimed, "But what about the fish? They'll eat us for sure." "We're not even sure if they're in the main waterway." Jiron picked up some of the discarded animal innards from when he prepped them. Walking to the river, he announced, "Only one way to find out." He threw the bloody mess into the water. They watched for a second, then he said, "See? Nothing to..." Suddenly, the water seemed to broil as a piranha-like fish swarmed. "See?" Michael cried out. Jiron glanced over to James. "That's going to be a problem." "Yeah, I was hoping they'd not be in the main river." Coming back over to them, Michael plopped himself down and asked, "Now what?" James looked at him and said, "Let's just eat while we think about it. There's bound to be a way." While the animals were cooking, they pondered the situation. "How about a raft?" suggested Michael. "What would we use?" Jiron asked him. "No logs or large limbs to use, and nothing with which to secure them together." "We could try to swim fast," James offered, much to the horror of Michael, who shook his head violently. "Just kidding," he chuckled. Michael flashed him an "I'm not amused" look. "There's got to be a way," Jiron said. "I'm sure there is," James replied, "and one that wouldn't require us to enter the water," he added for Michael's benefit. "Could you get us there with magic?" Jiron asked. "I don't know, maybe," he said. "But if something should happen to break my concentration, then we drop into the river." They sat in silence for a while longer until the animals were fully cooked. When they were ready, Jiron handed him each one, and they set to with a hearty appetite. Now, for those who have read the series before, you're thinking, "Well, you can, James. I mean, you've done it before, or will do it, right?" But at this point in time, he isn't 100% confident in his magical ability. Sure, he can make the ground explode, he can throw rocks, and things like that, and sometimes he can make magic do something. But when thinking about levitating himself over a river filled with piranha-like fish, where one lapse in concentration would dunk them into the river to certain death, that nervousness might just have prevented him from being able to do the magic continuously. And so he didn't have confidence in himself yet. He's a far cry from where he is now. During the course of the meal, Jiron suddenly asked, "How about a bridge?" "That would take too long to build," James told him. No, he said. "I mean a natural one." "Well, that would be nice," James said, "but I don't see any around here." Jiron glanced toward him and said, "But you can make one." "How?" James asked. One second. He pointed down to where the other fork of the river continued on and said, "Look, there's a tall tree down there on this side of the river that might span the water." "How would he cut it down?" Michael asked. "We don't have any axes or anything." Nodding toward James, he said, "You can knock it down with magic. After what I've seen you do to buildings, this shouldn't be too difficult." Looking at the tree in the distance, he slowly nodded. "Might be able to arrange that. Give me a moment to think about it," he said as he finished his lunch. He tossed what was left into the river, and the little fishes consumed it. Then he walked over to the tree and worked on the particulars of what he would do. It definitely looked tall enough to span the water after it fell, providing it fell in the correct direction. That shouldn't be a problem. He just needed to direct the magic to steer it that way. Once he was ready to make the attempt, he motioned for the others to stand back several yards as he began to concentrate. Michael watched him as he stood there, 5 feet from the base of the tree. Suddenly, the base popped as bark flew in all directions. The top tipped, and at first it looked to be falling more along the river than across it. But then, as if a giant hand grabbed it, the tree swung more toward the opposite shore. With a loud crashing, it landed with the top of its branches well on the far side of the river. They congratulated James as he watched the water passing just under the trunk of the tree. "Good job!" exclaimed Miko. "If we are careful, it is unlikely we'll fall in," Jiron said as he climbed onto the trunk. "Let me go first, and if it's safe, you two can follow." Michael and James kept near the trunk while he made his way to the other side. The tree was fairly stable, the branches beneath it forming a secure contact with the riverbed. The branches above afforded many handholds, so falling off would not be a problem. They watched Jiron make his way through the limbs to the other side, and finally came to stand on the opposite shore. "No problem," he shouted back. "Want to go next?" James asked Michael. Nodding, he climbed up onto the trunk and made his way to the other side. Once he was there, James worked his way across and found carrying his stick with him would prove difficult. So he tossed his walking stick into the water and continued on across. The branches gave him ample handholds with which to maintain his balance, even with his injuries. There was one heart-stopping moment when his injured leg lost its balance and he almost fell, but by grabbing a couple branches in a death grip, which renewed the pain in his side, he was able to right himself and continue on. Reaching the far side, he climbed down and joined them by the river. Michael handed him another walking stick he had located while James crossed. He took the stick and said, "Thank you." "Should we continue following it?" Jiron asked, indicating the main river from which the one they'd been following had split. "I would think so." Without another word, Jiron turned and began looking for the best path to take. With the river flowing steadily on their left, they continued through the swamp. By nightfall, the landscape had begun to change from an area filled with stagnant pools to a more pleasant, forested-type area. "I think we may be finally reaching the edge of this infernal swamp," Jiron announced when they stopped for the night. "It looks like it," agreed James. "The air is fresher, and there are not nearly the number of annoying bugs to deal with." They made camp at the water's edge, and James went into the woods, soon returning with several animals for dinner. By this time, the others had a fire going, and they relaxed around it as their dinner cooked. The evening passed uneventfully. Each took their turn at watch. When the sun rose in the morning, James was happy to find his leg beginning to itch, knowing that was an indication of healing. His side was doing better as well. Some of the scabs were beginning to flake around the edges. The strain he'd put on it when he'd almost fallen in the river seemed to have little lasting effect. See, he's already scabbing, and they're starting to flake off. I mean, for me, that takes weeks, right? But it's only been like 3-4 days. I'm thinking it was the amulet. The Morcyth is helping him. Maybe Igor's helping him along by healing him up. Who knows? You know, if your worker needs help, you do what you can to make sure he can survive, right? His leg barely ached when he tested his weight on it when they were ready to go. Not bothering with the walking stick any longer, he was better able to keep up with Jiron. They made better time than the day before. Maintaining a northerly course as they followed the river, they continued for several hours. The ground became firmer, and soon the only water they encountered was that of the river which flowed next to them, as well as a few small tributary streams. They relaxed as they continued on, more comfortable in the familiar setting of the forest. They made good speed through the rest of the day. When it began getting dark, they again made camp, with James hunting for food while the others got the fire going. Once he returned with dinner, they found them relaxing around the fire. He said, "This is nice." "What is?" asked Jiron. "Just being in the forest. No one trying to kill us," he said wistfully. "I have always liked being among the trees. It has always brought me peace." "Not me," said Michael. "This forest makes me nervous." Laughing, James replied, "That's because you're a city boy. Spend more time out here and you'll come to appreciate it all the more." Michael looked at him doubtfully and said, "So far, they've been nothing but trouble." "I suppose it could seem that way," Jiron joined in. "If we weren't in the Empire, at least I think we're still in the Empire, then it would feel different." "Maybe," he said, still not convinced. When the meal was over, Jiron offered to take the first watch. Michael turned to him and asked, "If the woods are such a great place, why are we bothering with the watch?" "Animals," James said. Jiron nodded. "Can never be too careful," he replied. Giving them a frown, Michael turned over and eventually fell asleep. James and Jiron sat up for a little while longer, talking. "He sure can be negative sometimes," Jiron said quietly to James. "I know," he replied. Had to do with his life, I would imagine. Being alone on the streets where everybody tried taking what you have doesn't tend to build trust. "I suppose," Jiron said. "I was on the streets too, and am not that way." "True," replied James. "But what would you have been like if Tersa hadn't been alongside you, or if that guy hadn't got you into the pits?" Remember earlier, I think book 2, early book 2, they were talking about how he was in the pits and how some guy found him and got him into the pits. Well, we're going to go into more of that here. "I see what you mean," he said. "I see what you mean." Then he smiled and laughed quietly. "What?" James asked him. "Oh, I was remembering a time after I had been in the pits for a while," he explained. "Kalen, that was his name, was on his way to get me for another fight. He said he always wanted to take me to them, not for us to meet there. Anyway, he was coming toward me from when out of nowhere a tomato sailed toward him and hit him right in the side." Starting to giggle a little more, he said, "You should have seen him. He was mad and was looking around to see where the tomato had come from. When he saw who it was that had ruined his blue vest, he started yelling and ran toward them, most likely intending to beat them up or something, but he never got the chance. He didn't take 3 steps before he slipped in a puddle. Beginning to laugh more, he continued. He got up, mud all over himself, and looked around for his hat. He saw it sitting in the road a few feet away. Just as he was getting up to retrieve it, a horse came along and put his hoof right on the hat and began walking away with the hat still stuck to the hoof. The hat stuck to the underside of the hoof of its hoof. All right. Just as he was getting up to retrieve it, a horse came along and put his hoof right on the hat and began walking away with the hat stuck to the underside of its hoof. James laughed too as he continued. Finally, the horse put its hoof in another mud puddle, and the hat didn't come back out. Kalen got up, covered in mud, and went over to retrieve his hat. When he pulled it out of the mud puddle, the hat was completely ruined. There was a hole in it, not to mention the mud and other stuff stuck to it that had been in the mud puddle. He actually put the hat back on after shaking it and getting most of the muck off, he said, laughing even more. He looked around, but the kids who had thrown the tomato were nowhere to be found. Laughing, James looked over to Miko and was pleased to find that their merriment hadn't woke him. He sat there a while, listening to the fire crackle and pop as he continued thinking about Kalan. The picture of him walking around in a dirty, soaked hat and a blue vest with a big red stain on it kept him chuckling for a while. Then suddenly, it all stopped. Blue vest? And a hat? He looked at Jiron, who poked the fire absentmindedly with a stick. Could it have been? Just what did Kalan look like, he asked. Looking at the fire, Jiron said, "Oh, not much to talk about, really. Looks sort of ordinary. He might have come from one of the kingdoms farther north, I think. He was short, though. Didn't come up to my shoulders, as I recall. But that didn't affect his fighting abilities. Never saw anyone who could fight like him. He used to say, it's not the size of your opponent, but his skill that will take you down. And he was right." Sitting back, again lost in thought, James considered what he just heard. It had to be the little guy. But why? He stared over to Jiron as he tried to think things through. He felt like no other I've ever seen. Maybe Igor arranged it so I'd have help along the way? Or was there something more to it? Whatever the reason, I'm glad to have him with me. I doubt if I could have survived if I hadn't. He settled down to sleep, for he was taking the mid-watch, which was the worst for getting enough rest. You don't get enough before your shift, and you have a hard time going back to sleep afterward. Finally, though, he did manage to fall asleep. Okay, let's put it to rest. Yes, that was Igor. The next book, Trail of the Gods. That isn't a path like on the cover. It has a trail going up a cliffside, a mountainside. That's not the kind of trail I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is a trail of things that leads James from one to another to get to the end. See, the way I think of it, okay, when I was growing up, it would drive me crazy when people like Gandalf or whoever gave cryptic answers to people. They didn't know what they were talking about, but it all came clear later on. And that just drove me crazy. So why don't you just tell him what he's supposed to know? But it occurred to me while writing all this, okay, if Igor had said to James the moment he got there in the first book, it says, okay, you need to go here and do this, he would have headed there and died. So he said, he gave him the amulet with the Morcyth symbol on it, didn't tell him about it, and just says, do what you think is right. Because someone who would do what was right, the right kind of person, would follow the path. And a person from James's homeworld, Earth, would be able to follow that path, and only they would be able to follow that path. So, the path was like, okay, first get to Trindle. Well, he made it to Trindle, and while he's there, Hearn was missing. Ended up taking out someone else who had gotten taken over by a demon. That girl with San Francisco on her shirt, and then and talking to the people there, he realized that maybe he needed to learn about the amulet, because after all that happened, Igor gave him the amulet. Well, so he didn't know what was going on. So what was there about the amulet? See, the amulet was the next part of the trail. Well, everyone says, well, go down to Cardri. There's a library there. And so he talked to Eleanor, or Ellenweird, and Ellenweird said it was Morcyth. So that was another clue. And he says that the high priest was from Saragon, and that the high temple was in the City of Light, which led him to the City of Light, which made him meet Jiron and Tenok, and Cassie, and Delia, and Tersa eventually. Of course, he found Michael along the way. Michael gets captured, forces James all the way down south, coming back up, and now we're here. See, trail, little things. That's why gods can't tell mortals what to do. Mortals have to figure it out on their own, so when they finally figure it out, they're able to do what needs to be done. Anyway, that ends chapter 7. I went a little bit long there. If you have any questions about that, put it in the comments. I really don't care if you put in spoilers, because this stuff here is mainly for people who've already read it. And if people are listening to this and have not read the first 2 books, stop. Read the first 2 books first. This will mean much more, because it's basically one continuous story. Anyway, y'all take care, and subscribe to my channel, be a big help, and comment. Just say hi, whatever. I like your story, read more, or whatever. Just comment. And if you shared it, that'd be great too. Y'all take care. I'll talk to you tomorrow.